And thanks so much for choosing Morning Live. Now, at the press briefing yesterday, South African Airways also said that it's simply not in a position to afford the 8% wage increase demanded by unions. SAA says it can only afford a 5.9% increment effective from March next year. And we heard earlier from NUMSA spokesperson that that simply will not fly. So to tell us more about this, I'm joined in studio now by SAA board member and chairperson of the Board Implementation Committee, Martin Kingston. Thanks so much for coming through. So let's start at the talks that were held. NUMSA spokesperson Pagamile Hlubi-Majola says all was well until you then decided to withdraw an offer that was on the table of around 6.5%. So what happened?
Well, good morning, Zakina. The reality is that there was no new offer on the table. We as a company are exploring options with the unions to see how we can tighten our belts collectively to ensure the viability, sustainability, and I have to say survival of the airline. The 5.9% that has been offered is contingent on us getting funding next year. That funding is not currently in place. We've repeatedly explained to the unions that we can only discharge our obligations when we have secured that funding in the fullness of time, and the 5.9% frankly is more than we can afford as well.
So at no point was there a 6.5% issue on the table during your negotiations?
No, I have no doubt that there were a range of options that were explored between management and the unions. The management doesn't have a mandate to offer anything more than the 5.9%. The Minister of Public Enterprises made it clear in his statement yesterday that there is no additional finance available. So it's frankly impossible that we can offer more than had already been committed to. And that, as I said, is subject to funding being available.
So what it comes down to is the affordability factor, and you're saying simply SAA cannot afford these increases, even the 5.9% that you have put on the table. So NUMSA is saying that they have actually made a proposal to the minister, and they have also spoken to SAA management and executive about ways and means where the airline can actually save money that could possibly fund these increases.
We should absolutely, with unions and all other stakeholders, explore every way in which we can save money for the airline. Mutual gain sharing is certainly something that we would consider, but only when we've actually secured those gains. At the moment, we're trading at very significant losses, borne, I have to say, by the taxpayers of South Africa, who can ill afford to support and subsidize the airline, given the other very pressing needs. And therefore, we're not in a position to do anything than see how we can actually save money for the airline. If and to the extent that the unions have got initiatives in that regard, then they should absolutely put them on the table, and we'll constructively explore them with them.
So, of course, where all of this stems from is the fact that your pilots did get a 5.9% increase, and it was explained when your acting CFO and spokesperson were here. They explained how that came about. But obviously, the perception of that you would have money to pay an increase to a certain sector of your workforce and not to others is essentially what seems to have landed us in this position.
Well, we understand that, and the 5.9%, as you will have heard from the executive of the airline, was imposed upon us through a process, a legal process, contractually binding, under a regulatory agreement that's been in place effectively since 1988. It's been renegotiated since then. The pilots equally are well aware of the fact that we can ill afford the 5.9%, and we're in discussions with them about how we can reduce our exposure to that obligation to the extent it's possible.
And that's one of the issues that keeps coming up. People talk about these evergreen contracts that state-owned entities and SAA alike find themselves, having to honor. What's the status of that? Is SAA renegotiating some of these, trying to get rid of some of these evergreen contracts?
So the board has made it very clear, including to the pilots, that to the extent that there is scope to renegotiate contracts that are not in the best interest of the airline, we must do that on a fair, transparent and equitable basis. That doesn't just apply, by the way, to the regulating agreement and the pilots. It applies to all contracts that might have been put in place by previous boards and management. The reality is that we have inherited some very unsatisfactory and onerous obligations that need to be examined. The bigger problem that we have is at the moment Rome is burning. We don't have the time or the luxury to consider industrial action or any way which harms or undermines the prospects for SAA. This strike is exactly what is doing to SAA. It is actually pushing us over the precipice rather than helping to salvage the airline.
And of course, many people are going to look at that and going to want to see what SAA actually does about this. So, you know, obviously the pressure is on in that regard. But also with regard to the financial liquidity of the airline, you last week were supposed to present those financials to Parliament as SAA, and you were unable to. Are you now on track to meet the next deadline towards the end of the month?
So we have committed to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, as you say, last week, that in fact next week we will give them a route map as to how we can produce those accounts. The problem that we have with the accounts is that we don't know whether to prepare them on a going concern basis or on a liquidation basis. If we prepare them on a liquidation basis, the company needs to be placed into liquidation. That has catastrophic implications, not only for the company, but I have to say for many stakeholders, for all of the direct and indirect workers, and indeed for the country at large. It's the last thing we want to do. To prepare them on a going concern basis, we need to be confident that we have the financial wherewithal to trade for the next 12 months on a solvent basis. That is not currently the case.
Well, this fortunately or unfortunately is quite precise. So at this point, as you and I are sitting here, you actually do know which way this is going.
That's correct.
So which way is it going?
So unless we are able to secure guarantees from National Treasury, and we're in discussions with them as you and I speak, then the board will have to recommend to government that actually it be placed in liquidation, because we have no confidence that we can continue to trade responsibly. That's an ongoing and current discussion with National Treasury.
So, barring that, is there anything else that could save or change, alter the financial situation of SAA?
Barring that, we will have to responsibly close down SAA and salvage what aspects of the business are salvageable. That would be, I have to say, an extremely unfortunate, I've characterized it as a catastrophic outcome, but in the final analysis, that will be the only option that's available, I believe, to both the board and the shareholder. The shareholders indicated they're not prepared to put any further funding behind SAA. We have surplus guarantees on our balance sheet. We've requested to the shareholder that we be allowed to use them. That's an ongoing discussion. It's an imminent decision that's going to have to be taken.
So if the shareholder is indicating that, and the minister reiterated that with the unions yesterday,
well, the only outstanding thing, as I said, Sakina, is utilizing the guarantees. The banks will not advance us any further credit without them being secured and supported by a sovereign guarantee. As I said, we have surplus guarantees that are available, subject to National Treasury being satisfied that it's an appropriate use. Now, we are in that discussion with National Treasury and our shareholder currently. The outcome of that is not clear to us.
Let's talk timeframes. You know, what are some of the short, medium and long-term timeframes that you need to work towards in order to keep this airline intact and afloat if by some means, you know, money does become available?
We've indicated that we need 2 billion rand, which can be secured by the guarantees. We've got confirmation from the banks that money will be made available. In fact, we need to secure some proportion of that before the end of the month if we're going to be able to pay people's salaries. As you said, we are going to commit to SCOPA next week as to a longer-term process to file our accounts. But utilising 2 billion rand is inadequate for the current financial year. We've already indicated that our losses will far exceed that, exacerbated by the strike. We think that's at least 50-odd million rand per day. That's before we consider the franchise impact, the fact that customers are losing confidence and that suppliers will tighten their terms of credit. It's a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. So we think that in the next month, it will become apparent as to whether or not we can trade out of the current situation or whether there needs to be a responsible liquidation of the airline.
So, as things stand right now, you actually are not negotiating, if we're being frank. What you have on the table is all you can afford.
That's absolutely
There's
correct.
No room for negotiation, as it were.
The negotiation is how we can find ways to cut costs, not to increase costs. There is no money in the bank account to pay anybody. Not the 5.9% today, not any other costs down the road, unless and until such time as we secure the funding. We're not in a position to make any commitments to anybody. I believe that the unions and all other stakeholders need to recognize that. All they are doing, unfortunately, is accelerating the demise of SAA. I would characterize this as being extremely reckless and irresponsible, but that's their prerogative.
Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you to SAA board member, Martin Kingston. And at a press briefing yesterday, South African Airways said that it simply is not in a position to afford the 8%, which Martin has just reiterated now. So we'll keep our very beady eyes on this particular development, but let's take a break for now.